presentation is a collaboration between Heriot-Watt University and National Library of Scotland. The authors are Alistair Bell, Katherine Lloyd and Naomi Harvey. Alistair and Naomi will do the presentation. I'm going to give it to you first. And they're reimagining the relationship between collecting institutions and communities in the digital environment with insights from Scotland's Sounds. So please, in your own time. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Very glad to be in Glasgow, and thanks for Maria for organising such a great event. We're very pleased to be here. This paper is kind of born out of a collaborative doctoral partnership between Heriot-Watt University and the National Library of Scotland. And so the co-authors, myself and Naomi Harvey, but also Dr. Katherine Lloyd, who's sitting down here. You might recognise her later on as the person growing a baby, so go and speak to her afterwards, as she's had a lot of input into this as well. So in this paper, drawing on our respective roles as curator and academics, we aim to introduce and briefly examine some of the practical and theoretical issues surrounding the Scotland Sounds network. Scotland Sounds is a network of individuals and organisations holding sound recordings, including many organisations in the museums, libraries and archives sector, in national, local authorities, university, community settings as well. Collectively, the network has an overarching aim to improve the care and access of sound recordings. This is what we call caring and sharing of sound collections, which we know are often neglected parts of these institutions, of these organisations. To date, as well as focusing on engaging with the public and also doing a lot of knowledge exchange programmes and trying to share that knowledge and expertise in sound between organisations, because we know a lot of people who look after these collections aren't in the care of these, don't have enough knowledge to tackle sound recordings, whether it be tapes or discs or whatever it might be in their collections. So as well as doing the public engagement and knowledge exchange, the network is a collaborative activity strengthening ties between organisations, hosting sound collections and sharing responsibility for their sustainable access. In terms of evaluating the impact of digital cultural resources, the questions that are pertinent to the Scotland Sounds network are those concerning the relationships between institutions, communities and individuals in the digital environment. So, what is the function of collecting institution in the age where individuals and communities can share their collections online? Does digital technology change the relationships between communities and memory institutions? And does digital technology afford an expansion of the remit of memory institutions, or indeed require institutions to change their remit entirely in this digital age? Currently, perhaps the roles of the institution and community are too rigid or too vague. That is, the idea of this presenter or collector and user, or perhaps there's a vagueness around this idea of how we collect and share and those responsibilities within the digital environment. So in this paper, we argue that Scotland Sounds needs a varied approach to evaluation, at the heart of which is an acknowledgement that a wider relationship exists between heritage organisations involved in our network, in Scotland Sounds, and communities and individuals who create, own, transmit, donate, use and reuse these sound collections. So it's not a one-way relationship, it's many ways relationship. As this conference highlights, our understanding of the motivations of users of digital resources has historically been somewhat limited. Scotland Sounds, through other elements of the project, is concerned with measuring use and evaluating in more traditional ways, so through metrics of users, doing surveys, website metrics, etc. But for Scotland Sounds to meet its mission to improve care and access to sound collections, we need to understand more about this interaction between institutions and communities. And what data is available in this area? The answer is we don't know. So at the moment, our existing methodologies offer limited insights into the issues that are fundamental to understanding the impact and value of Scotland Sounds, or indeed our wider understanding of the nature of participatory practice in the digital environment. Our solution is to have a dedicated researcher to explore this landscape, and as part of this presentation, Naomi Harvey is going to be outlining some of her methodological approach to understanding these issues. So it's worth saying we're in the very early stages of this research partnership, and Naomi only started in October. So this is a question-posing paper. We're not here to say this is the research we've done and these are our findings. This is very much about asking these questions and thinking about our network and the relationship that we have in a different way than traditionally, I suppose, that we would have looked at that relationship. So by exploring and better understanding these relationships, can we establish new models for preserving access to digital content? As sound recordings have been collected and preserved by different institutions, organisations and individuals, this has resulted in significant variations between the collection format, accessibility and longevity. Many sound recordings are created out with the domain of public institutions. We're not recording this stuff ourselves. It's being recorded in communities and by people. Instead, held within community organisations which may lack the funding or expertise to both preserve and provide access to their sound material. So it's often oral history projects. They tend to be short-term funded, small projects that have a specific lifespan. And it's thinking about sustainability and preserving access to those collections. Short-term preservation of sound collections can often be possible through uploading content to online platforms. So there's SoundCloud, YouTube, etc., etc. There's lots that have disappeared in the past. MySpace, we would have been talking about 10 years ago. So it's thinking about those platforms. The long-term longevity of these digital collections is reliant on the commercial sustainability of such services. So MySpace has disappeared. YouTube is only 10 years old, yet people are thinking it's going to last forever. But when they're no longer commercially viable, they pull the plug. What happens to all the stuff? In contrast, sound collections held within cultural institutions may be inaccessible to their originating communities due to difficulties in providing on-site access as a result of the absence of dedicated equipment and skills or low priority for audiovisual material within the collections. An example of one of the community organisations that are a part of Scotland Sounds network is Our Story Scotland. They collect, archive and present the life stories and experiences of the LGBT community in Scotland, the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender. This is largely through oral history recording, but also involves creative outputs such as drama and exhibitions on the lives of LGBT people. Our Story Scotland are a great example of a community organisation that have archives at the core of their mission, which is demonstrated on their archive, on their website. This perhaps comes from a clear understanding of the value of the recording that is taking place. It mentions in another part of their website, our lives have often been maligned or suppressed, hidden or silenced. To establish a history from within the LGBT community, it is important to hear the stories of people's lives in their own words. This echoes the power of oral history recordings as a means of giving voice to marginalised communities, allowing their history to be voiced, recorded and heard. So, this all sounds good. However, when you begin to peel back some of the layers and speak to the volunteers who have run this oral history programme for a number of years, so I think since 2000, 2001, 2002, you begin to realise, the issues become more apparent. The issues for Our Story Scotland, and this is just one example, but there are lots of organisations like Our Story Scotland as part of our network. It's a community-led archives, and they have similar issues. So there's this fuzzy area around ownership, around access, and around sustainability. And Our Story Scotland is a good example of where this lies. So they're again proactive in developing partnership to archive their material, and that's why we know about them. So there's lots more out there that we don't know about. So that maybe aren't so proactive about thinking about the longevity or the archivability of what they're creating. The website, again, is testament to the partnerships they've forged with the National Museums Scotland and National Library of Scotland. But even after donation of material has been passed over to these institutions, in the traditional sense of acquiring material or collecting. The enduring desire for content to belong to the community and to be accessible to that community remains. So as such, conversations continued, and it was decided that despite an initial donation to the National Museums of Scotland to donate their archived material there, that it was the National Library that audio and video recordings should be placed, not only to ensure preservation, but to provide access to the material in a way that met the expectations of the LGBT community and those that had recorded their stories to be heard. So they had initially donated to the National Museums, but they weren't happy with the way that access was being provided, so they were starting to look for alternatives as to how they could find the right kind of access in the short term, but also preservation in the long term for the stuff that they've created, or the stuff they've recorded. So with content now due to be placed with the National Library, that institution, which is me and the people I represent, take on the responsibility of meeting these expectations from that community, from the LGBT community, that we have to provide access in the way that they want access to be met. Added to this is this example. So it's another complicated layer to decode. Our Story Scotland has a YouTube channel, so content is already shared, licensed, public domain. What does this mean? It's not a bad thing, but it does create extra layers of complexity around ownership and access, which institutions need to better understand. So what this example of Our Story Scotland provides is an indication of some of the issues that are a reality for our network, like Scotland Sounds. The digital environment creates or has created new issues around ownership, access, preservation and sustainability of sound recordings. This also provides an example of how digital affects perceptions of institutions. We need to investigate to be able to understand and respond to these issues. We need to understand this relationship between institutions and communities and individuals. The alternative, to lose these voices forever. So today and tomorrow we're discussing digital cultural resources from Scotland and beyond. As a representative of a national institution myself, the collections we hold are not ours. These collections belong to people. They're created by people. They belong to communities. They are their and our heritage. Digital resources belong to people. So as such, the relationship institutions have with people transcends this idea of product and user, or supplier and customer, or presenter and audience. The resources Scotland Sounds have to share were given by communities and individuals and organisations, institutions have a responsibility to preserve access to these long term. That is our public role. So in attempting to evaluate the impact of digital cultural resources, we argue in this paper, the three of us, that we must move beyond methods that reinforce the categorisations of products and users. Instead, we aim to adopt a more holistic approach to understand how value is created through the relationship between institutions, communities and collections. This should include investigation across the span of the whole life cycle, from creation to archiving, and a consideration of all the elements in between. And as such, we have Naomi, whose PhD is looking at these areas and looking at how to tackle this area. So I'll just pass over to Naomi.
Sure. Just get myself plugged in. Hopefully that one's working and not tangle up wires there. So yes, thank you, Ali, for introducing me there, and thank you for having me to speak at the conference, despite only, as Ali said, starting on my research journey in October. I'll be talking, therefore, in a fairly general terms about the probable methods that I'll employ to explore this key question of how we can develop a better understanding of the relationship between institutions and communities dealing with sound in the digital environment. I intend to take a broadly ethnographic approach, catching up there, a broadly ethnographic approach to my research, combining case studies, observational fieldwork with interview and survey-based data collection across 4 very broadly defined areas of interest. These 4 areas will be given focus through investigating sound collections and materials that can be seen to represent intangible cultural heritage, as you can see from the proposed title of my PhD there. Although it's not within the scope of this paper to delve too deeply into the particulars of ICH and what that means, to state it simply, many of the genres that Scotland's sound network encompasses, as seen on the previous slide, can be seen to represent materials that fall under the UNESCO-defined domains of intangible heritage, such as music, song, oral histories, and so on. As I say, I'm not going to dwell on the concept, but if anyone wants to have an ICH chat, if it's your area of interest, then I'm more than happy to do so over coffee or whatever. So to conduct my research, I'll firstly engage with groups and individuals who are already on the Scotland Sound radar, as it were, whether that's through having taken part in surveys conducted by the network or attended their events and training workshops, or through a deeper working connection, such as in the example that we heard of Our Story Scotland. I'll examine the myriad issues faced by participants for common themes and explore how Scotland Sound's approach is helping engage with these issues by forging connections between groups and encouraging an environment of shared engagement and collaboration across the sector. The kind of thing I'm going to be looking at, I think, would be illustrated well by an example of the kinds of discussions that are emerging. I recently took the opportunity to observe the Scotland Sound Network in action by attending their stakeholders meeting last week in the room across the corridor there in this very building. And those that were at that stakeholders meeting represented participants from points all along the sound recording continuum, if you like, from people planning oral history projects to organisations which have amassed collections of digital sound and are now wondering what to do with them, how best to keep them, to archival institutions with concerns about long-term preservation and access to their collections. So during those discussions, an interesting divergence arose between attitudes and approaches by sound creators on one hand and sound archivists on the other around the issues of using mobile phones to record materials when speaking with participants. On the archivist side, there was an awareness of potential longevity issues caused by problematic file formats, sound quality and so on, whereas the creators felt that using mobile phones represents a solution that democratises the process of sound recording due to issues like ease of use, ubiquitousness of phones, everyone has them, everyone knows how to use them and so on. For myself as an observer, this difference seemed to stem from the intended use of sound recording. In the case of the creators, there was a sense that the recordings were being created for immediate impact on those who were being recorded. So they're ranging across projects involving people in vulnerable situations, from newly arrived refugees to school children in rural communities that were facing depopulation, to homeless people. In all of these cases, the common motivation for recording was a sense of identity building in the present, and this took precedence over concerns of longevity, perhaps. However, from the archivist viewpoint, it was clear that their concerns about preservation and problematic formats didn't devolve only from concerns about potential technical difficulties in the future, but also the viewpoint that if you consider the longevity of what you're recording at the time of creation, if you like, you're not just giving people a voice for now, you're also giving them a voice for the future, and that adds to the impact of the work that you're doing and the reason that you're doing it. I'm speaking somewhat simplistically and in broad terms perhaps, but what it highlighted to me from this initial observation is that one of the real strengths of the network format that Scotland Sound is taking is that it provides this knowledge exchange forum for participants to share ideas and develop a shared understanding of viewpoints and motivations from all points along this sound continuum. And hopefully from this new ways of thinking about how we deal with sound will emerge and also create this holistic understanding of the situation. So that's one area. The second area, the rest of them are much briefer, don't have such long examples to give. I'll also look to identify groups or individuals whose focus or activities relevant to Scotland Sound but who are not currently engaged and see what types of information they're looking at, what digital platforms are they using. Also interested to do field work with communities who, I think, as Ali referred to, they don't necessarily have the sound collections, but something about their practice or something about their identity is represented in collections that are held elsewhere. And I think that exploration is vital to these questions of ownership and representation that institutions can provide. And a final aspect, we'll look at data available from other projects in the field, because we don't want to be covering old ground or operate in isolation. So looking at other projects that have already carried out similar areas of work. So a couple of examples: the Sounds of Our Shore project run by the British Library, where they gathered sound recordings from using crowdsourced methods, where people uploaded sounds of the shoreline in their area, and that created a sound map for the British Isles. And I'm also looking forward greatly to hearing from other people during the course of the conference as well. The following paper, I think, is particularly interesting. And so just in conclusion, the aim of all this observation and data collection is to develop these practical solutions or working models for Scotland Sounds, but also, hopefully, it will be of wider relevance in this ever-evolving arena of heritage management, and will allow us to understand better the changing roles that heritage institutions and the communities they represent can play in the digital environment.
And I suppose the conclusion from our point of view is that the value of this approach, research, lies in privileging the experiences and needs of the communities and the individuals engaged in collecting, sometimes over the institutional agendas. And we hope that this methodology will enable us to get a better understanding of the issues and surrounding the digital cultural resources from both perspectives. I think this gives us more than if we did a market research approach to this. This isn't really just about the end user idea. It's really about this long-lasting, from creation, collecting, presenting, keeping, managing, preserving. I think I've said that one already. But the whole kind of life cycle. So it gives us data that Naomi will be out collecting to really bring back to Scotland Sounds and understand our relationship better when we're talking about these two sets of stakeholders really in that network. Thank you very much.